Well, I think, so usually I would stand and walk around and talk to them, but since they record these, and the audio is going to come through here, so because in the past when I've done research presentations here, I could walk back and forth and take the questions, and they yelled at me. They told me I needed to stand here.
Okay.
I don't really like that. I like it more informal, but yeah. So you did your undergrad at A&M, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah.
In econ?
Palisade.
Palisade econ?
Yeah.
So when were you at A&M? Like what
I
years?
finished in 2011. I was there in 2000, I guess 8, 9, because I did my first year somewhere else. And
Okay.
transferred in as a sophomore.
So yeah, I guess that 2008, 2009 was the only year where we overlapped.
And then I was in a sophomore as well. I was doing with life at all. Found my way to English school.
Yeah. Yeah, I think at that point I was only teaching 3,000. I mean, not 3,000, 209.
Ah, okay.
Methods course.
209. But there were so many 209s. Because there wasn't, I think it was a formal theorist.
Amir, Turar,
No, it was a woman. Maybe Russian.
Yelena, McLean.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we're all set.
Okay. You don't have one.
It's over there.
Oh, it's okay.
It's,
We'll get
Do we need
confused.
to introduce ourselves first and then before
Okay.
we go to material?
Ready? Oh, let's start. Okay. Let's get started then. Good afternoon, everybody. We're here. We're happy to have you all here for this information session. For the second week of the summer school. Today, the info session is about advice on achieving success in grad school. We're really honored to be here with Laron Williams and Soledad Prillaman. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And they're going to present some topics and then open to the floor for you to present your questions. Okay, so, but one warning, please don't forget to speak on the mic because you are transmitting online, okay? So I don't know which one of you is going to start.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea that we introduce ourselves. I'm Laron Williams from the University of Missouri. I've been out of grad school for, well, I don't think it's important that we say how long, just a couple years, maybe 1 or 2. And so I'm thankful that we were asked to do this presentation, and I'm hopeful that it will give you a little bit different insight than what you would get in the classroom or with your faculty members. Maybe Sole and I will be a little bit more honest about some things than you might get elsewhere, but I won't talk too much until.
I'm Sole Prillaman. I am actually pretty recently out of graduate school. I am doing a fellowship right now at Oxford and Nuffield College, and then in a year and a half will join Stanford in the political science department. And also will just happily say that I will be as honest as I can be, and so please feel free to, as you ask questions, really ask whatever you think would be useful or valuable. So.
Good. Okay, so I think what we decided on for an outline is Sole and I talked about a few of the broad themes we think would come up in this conversation, and so we'll briefly talk about those things. And what we really want from you guys is to ask questions. We'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have, and I think it'll be a lot more helpful if you're asking the questions that are you're interested in and you want answers. And then, so that means you can ask questions throughout the entire presentation, or you can wait until the end. We'll have some time at the end for questions and answers, but feel free to interrupt at any point. So the first topic we wanted to touch on, a very important part of grad school, is putting together your committee. So, you want to?
Sure. I'll just give a little bit of my background, what I went through with this, and then a few things that I learned in case that's useful. But then, as Laron said, also happy to hear what's on your mind. So from a research interest perspective, so I'm a comparative politics person. I mostly study India and tried to balance a set of sort of quantitative methods, sort of running experiments and surveys, which is what we're doing here, but also a lot of field work and qualitative interviews and things like that. And so one of the things that I learned over the course of grad school with my set of interests was the importance of having diversity on the committee itself. And by that I mean diversity in terms of substance, but also in terms of methods. So my experience was I started with a committee, third year of grad school, and by the time I finished, of the 4 people on my committee, 2 of them were completely different from the 4 that I started with. And it's not even indicative of the total number that were on the committee at any point in time. And so I think that says one thing, which is that you shouldn't see it as a static necessarily, but that you can, as your interests adapt, as well as your methods, so can your committee to match that. But also, I learned the importance of having diversity. So I started with a committee. I'm someone who, obviously for being here, as all of you are, who's really interested in methods and who loves getting very technical. So I started with 4 super technical methods people, but who couldn't help me at all when I was spending 6 months in a village in India and tell me what I needed to know to survive and manage that experience, and or help me develop some of my substantive questions related to that area. So I was like, okay, I need to find someone who can help me with this, and added them in. So in the end, what I can say worked for me, which will change for everyone else, was I had someone on my committee who really pushed me to think theoretically, who really pushed me to question all of the assumptions I was making, my hypotheses, and develop my theory. And I think that was absolutely critical. I had someone who was aligned with my substantive interest, who studied gender in India. I had somebody who was a big thinker and could help me frame my study within the larger literature. And then I had someone who was able to sit with me and talk through all the technicalities of my methods and make sure that I was, doing exactly what I needed to. So I think that was the biggest thing that I learned, and it took a lot of trial and error to get to the right committee itself. And then I just wanted to mention 2 other small things related to that. The first is related to the committee building together, which is that I just encourage you all to make sure that you also feel supported. And it's very important to surround yourself with people who are invested in your work, but also see the value that you're bringing. And everyone here has really interesting research ideas, and so I can't say enough for what it meant to me to have people who were like, this is not very good right now, but I know what you can do, and here's, and that support was really valuable. And then the last thing, which I think is tied into that, which is to reach out. My advice would be to reach out regularly. And for me, I'm someone who is not very good at keeping myself to a schedule, but also works really well under deadlines. And so having a set of, having something in my calendar where I emailed my committee every 2 weeks with an update on what I'd done was a really good built-in mechanism to make sure that I progressed through grad school at the rate at which I wanted to. So I'll leave it there on that, but I'm sure you have a lot more to add.
Yeah, excellent point. So, yeah.
No, you have to-
That's okay.
But the problem is about transmitting.
Oh, you
we
need
need
a
you to
mic.
talk on the mic.
Can we
That's the
have
one you
one
can
mic?
have.
Or he can say it and we can summarize.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You said that some of the members of your committee were not members of your committee anymore.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get rid of them?
Yeah, no, it's a good and important question. I mean, the truth is that as my interests changed, there was also an understanding on some of those committee members that they, were no longer the right person for the committee. Some were actually happy to have that explicitly said and in conversation when I said something like, I think my research is going in this direction. I think I should add someone around that. And they were like, you should, go for it. I think that with others, it was a natural fading out of the relationship when I didn't email them every 2 weeks, and then I hadn't emailed them in 8 months, and then they were like, clearly, you're doing something different. And And maybe that probably wasn't the best way to handle it. The best way would be to go in and get advice to say, here's what I think I need in a committee, and I think that, you know, to be more explicit in defining the relationship. But I also think that there was zero hard feeling on the side of anyone who didn't end up on the committee, and quite the opposite, that I was usually met, when I was very fearful in these situations, but I was usually met with nothing but support. People saying, you need to get out of this experience, what is best for you? You've made compelling arguments for why this is the case. You know, if it was because I was not, you know, for some other reason, then I think they would have said, they would have questioned it. But that was how I approached it.
Yeah, so what I want to add with the building a committee sort of question is, now Soli kind of laid out the ideal, you know, structure or architecture of your committee, where you've got somebody who's method savvy, somebody who thinks big picture, somebody who's very strong theoretically, and kind of fits in all the pieces that you need for your committee. A lot of people aren't going to be at schools where you've got a wide variety of people to choose from. And so you might be at a faculty or at a department where there's only 15 faculty. And at that point, you can't find somebody from each area that puts together, you know, perfectly. And so at that point, you want to find somebody who is more senior, right? Not an assistant professor to serve as your chair, right? You want somebody who's got tenure. They're going to be more established in the field. They've got more time to devote to you rather than working on their own research. And you want to find somebody in your own field, right? So in your own area of expertise. But besides that, I think one of the most important things for you to look for is to find a chair that will provide you with opportunities, like extra opportunities beyond the classroom. Things like this, things like coming here, finding out, you know, extra places for you to go for a methods summer school or additional methods training, helping you to locate fellowships for field research, postdocs, special issues, conferences. If you can locate a faculty member who provides those sorts of opportunities for the students, that is somebody you want to be with. And hopefully that would also be somebody you've developed a relationship with, somebody in your field, somebody who is more senior. Yeah, Thiago.
So what do you think is the role, and based on what criteria we should select the outside member?
So the question is, what are the criteria you should use for selecting the outside member? So that's a good question. So you could either go with it in a couple different ways. You could go as picking somebody who would help you methodologically or substantively. So try to identify the weaknesses in your dissertation and try to locate somebody who helps take care of those weaknesses. So if you need to learn language, then you might seek somebody who, you know, teaches in that language. Or if you need to do experiments, then you might locate somebody outside of your department who is useful with experiments. It just depends on what are the weaknesses of your dissertation and what do you want to improve on.
Do you think, if you're applying for political science, but then you get a professor from, I don't know, economics, do you think it's good to have a recommendation letter from this person?
It's never going to hurt. So when you apply for jobs, you're going to send at least 3 letters of recommendation. So one of those has to be from your chair. Has to be. Otherwise, it'll look weird. I've been on hiring committees where somebody will submit an application for a job and they won't have a letter from their chair, and you'll think, well, that's strange, right? Something probably went wrong there. Mm-hmm. So it's got to be from your chair. If you've published with somebody who's a professor, it should be from that person as well, because that person in the letter of recommendation will be able to say, Thiago did this part of the paper, or in this part of the paper. What you want to make sure is that professor isn't doing all of the writing and then you're just on the paper as a co-author. And then maybe another member on your committee as the 3rd letter, and then as the outside member, your 4th, right? They can talk about your expertise in, you know, how well you can speak English or your knowledge of experiments or whatever.
And I would second all of this and maybe add, so I had an economist as my outside member on my committee who was based at a public policy school. And I don't think that was a problem at all. And tying into the first answer that Laron gave, I think in identifying a hole that you see in your committee or your dissertation and using that to identify an outside member, the value is you can also be very clear with that person what you expect from them. And so that then when it comes to them writing you a letter, they can say, I know all of this about how this person has worked. For me, there was no one who studied India in my department, and so I found someone who did. And so she was able to speak directly to my ability to do field work and how much time I'd spend in the field and how well I knew the case. And she knew that that was the role that she was playing in the committee. And I think that helped her in also tailoring her support for me too.
Other questions about building a committee before we move on? Okay, so the next topic we wanted to cover was networking. Fun. You wanna?
Sure. To be honest, my thoughts on networking are a bit scattered. I think there are some clear ones. The first is that I was told from very early on in my career to go to conferences, and I think that was incredible advice. Although conferences are intimidating, they are not necessarily pleasant if you don't know a lot of people. You walk into a room and there can be lots of people. But I think they're really valuable, and I think getting that experience early, it gets better every time you go to a conference until it hits the point where it's a lot of fun. It does take a little bit of time. And so, and by that, I want to speak to two different types of conferences. So there are the big discipline conferences that happen around the world, and I think it's really valuable to be there, to be engaging with work, to be presenting your own work at those conferences. But usually those aren't necessarily the best spaces for feedback or for developing sort of a relationship with people in your field. And so in addition, I think it's really valuable to seek out smaller conferences or workshops or settings where the people who study what you study are going to be sitting in the same room for 2 days straight. And then by the end, they're all going to know who you are. And I think that's really important. A small piece of advice or something that was really valuable for me, a piece of advice I received when I started grad school was that when you are at one of the big conferences, don't hesitate to reach out to people. Sending an email a couple months in advance saying, your work has been really important to me, can we get coffee sometime? I don't think I've ever been said no to. And that was a way to leverage those for something that was like beneficial. And some of those have turned into working relationships. Some of those were really valuable relationships on the job market when I, needed to talk to someone in a school I was applying to and I knew them. So I think there are ways to use those experiences to improve your network. But I think I'm not going to say unfortunate, but the challenging part of being a grad student and trying to network is that it requires an extreme amount of proactiveness to set up these meetings, to reach out, to go to these things, to put yourself in what may be for some, not necessarily for all, uncomfortable positions. But I do think it really pays off, and I think that sometimes in some settings, we don't get enough advice to do these things that actually matter for our job placements, for our co-authorship relationships, for sort of everything in our career.
And this is another area where your dissertation committee and your advisor can help you, right? Your advisor can say, all right, after your last panel of the day, we're going to have some drinks at this bar. I'd like you to come with me. These 3 people are going to be there, and I'd love to introduce you to them. And then you start developing those relationships that way. So my overall point with networking is that networking is usually where your opportunities for fun things and things that are going to really help your career, that's where they come from. Now, networking will never get you that job or get you the publication. It'll never do that for you. What it will do is it will put you in a position where you can get that, right? It'll give you the opportunity for then you to shine and do a great job on your job interview or get a publication. You guys know who Michael Jordan is, right? Michael Jordan, basketball player, right? Okay. So there's a quote that he has. He says, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? And so networking allows you to take shots, right? You might miss some of those shots. You might make some. When you make those shots, you've got a postdoc or you've got a publication in a special issue or something. And so it's really important for you to go to these conferences, especially the small ones, especially the workshops. Those are 100 times more helpful, more productive than the big Midwest or APSA or things like that. So go to those and meet as many people as you can. Yeah, and then after you see them a couple times and after you go get coffee with them or go get a drink, then you can approach them maybe to read a paper of yours or just put yourself out there. So it is tough for some people who are not outgoing, but the good thing about political science and academics overall is that, well, usually we're kind of awkward overall, right? And so you're awkward, I'm awkward, we can be awkward and talking, so it's okay. Like, no one's going to be like, oh, I can't believe I talked to that grad student. No, they were all grad students at some point, and they were all in your position. So please talk to people.
And I think the last thing, just to add on this, is that it doesn't always require going somewhere else to network. If there's ever anyone visiting your university, and you find out you see a poster somewhere or something, shoot them an email. Ask for a coffee meeting or something like that. Sign up for a dinner or a meal. It's an easy way to get to know people without having to do that, and has all these benefits that Laron mentioned.
Questions about networking? Okay, so the next topic we wanted to talk about was publishing. It's easy, right? Yeah, sure. Just write something, send it out, and get it published, right?
Somehow the first bullet I have is that it's hard. So
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you can go.
No, so really, what I wanted to say about publishing is, so throughout grad school, you might have the opportunity to write other papers with other professors, and it might be in areas that are not necessarily in your area of interest. Those are fine, just don't let those distract from what you want to do, from your dissertation topic. Because in the end, after 5 years, you'll go out on the market and you'll try to get a job, and you want to be able to show that you've got a consistent and clear research agenda. And if you're going off on way too many of these side projects, it's going to be tough to convince a hiring committee that you do Indian politics or you do quantitative methodology if you've got all these other things going on. So make sure that you're writing in your own area, and make sure that you also differentiate it from what your advisor does, right? You don't want to be a clone or an exact copy of what your advisor does, because chances are you'll be like a bad version of your advisor. And so you don't want to do that. You want to differentiate yourself from them. And then if you're too similar, then everything that you work on and publish with your advisor, they'll think, well, that's just his advisor writing that, or that's just her advisor writing it. Do you have anything?
Yeah, so I definitely want to, it wasn't something that I noted down, but want to reiterate this point about focusing on a topic, an agenda, and a dissertation. One of the things that I can now say, having left grad school, but I observed, was that the big ideas that you ask and what you ultimately put into your dissertation do seem to be the things that people are most excited for and seem to be the things that really are rewarded. And so investing in those as much as you can, I think can even save some of, I think having a bunch of disjointed publications often is less valued than having a clear agenda that you've made progress towards and is a really interesting idea. A few things I would add, though, so I think that's the key point. I would say that it's not, that if there are things that are useful to do to start working through the publishing process, I think it might be worth finding one paper, maybe two, that you could start to think about about putting through that process as a grad student. And I think there are clear ways to do that are beneficial to you. The first is that I think you should talk to each other and co-author with other grad students and find people who are working on similar things to you, who you see a lot regularly, who you can just start to invest in some of these things. And I know there's a lot of variation in where people are at, but I think starting to think about these things early on is usually better, so that then you can spend the later years of grad school focusing on your dissertation work. And then I would say, once you have something, just start to send it out. Even if it doesn't result in a publication, learn the process of publishing and use that process to improve upon the work that you're doing as early as you can. But I would say minimize how much distraction that causes in life.
Yeah, so chances are you'll be at a place that for you to be able to get the job you want, you'll have to have some publications while you're in grad school, right, that you can put on your CV. So when you're applying for jobs, you can demonstrate that you've got the research experience. Soledad is right that you should write stuff and then just send it out and see what happens. What I would suggest, though, is having somebody read it, a professor or even a grad student, if you can't get a professor on your committee, have somebody read it over and provide comments to you before you send it out, for at least the first time you send out a paper.
Yeah.
Because chances are you'll not see some of the errors that somebody else will see, and they might be small errors. It might take you only a week or a couple days to revise it, and then once you finally get it back out, you'll be in a much better position, because then the reviewers won't be able to say, oh, you messed up on X, Y, and Z, and so it's an easy rejection, okay?
And to add to that, you could also present this at conferences and tie it into the idea of networking. And both to get, I do think this is a critical point, both to get feedback on the work itself, but also because there are a set of norms around publishing that, like, before you've ever done it, you don't know how you're supposed to cite people and how you're supposed to frame the first page and all of that. And so having someone who's been through that process give you concrete feedback on how to make it a publishable paper is, I think, really valuable and may not take more than a week or so of revision.
One thing I'll note is that when you send something out, it will get rejected. That's just going to happen. It's too bad, and you need to learn how to handle that rejection. I would say in my career, for every one piece of good news that I get 4 pieces of bad news. And some reviewers will be mean. Like, they will say, I don't think you know what you're talking about. They'll say, I've certainly read better papers than this, and they will reject it. You just have to deal with it. Like, you just have to learn whatever coping strategies or whatever to deal with it. One thing you can do to make it so that it's not just a complete waste of time is, if you get rejected, treat that rejection as an R&R, like a revise and resubmit. And by that, I mean, you get your reviews, and it's a rejection. They hated it. Well, chances are they hated it for some reasons. So what can you do about it? Go through their reviews and go point by point and see exactly how you can respond to each of those points, right? Make changes to the theory, add a couple control variables that they want, do whatever they want, because chances are, at the end of that process, it's going to be a better paper. And you know who's probably going to get that paper as a reviewer the next journal you send to? That same person, okay? And so if you send it back out without making any changes, and that reviewer gets it, that's the easiest rejection he or she will ever have to make. Because they'll look at the paper, they'll be like, didn't make any changes, same review, send it back off. It's a rejection. So treat it as a rejection and resubmit. Don't resubmit to the same journal. You can't do that, but send it to a different journal. And at least that way you haven't wasted those 2 or 3 months where you were waiting to hear back on the review. Any questions? Publishing? Yes, sir.
Do you have any advice on how to come up with research questions?
So the question is, how do you come up with research questions? Well, so you're supposed to think about things in terms of puzzles. So with a puzzle, you've got all these different pieces that are out there. And you know that they fit together and they tell some story. But right now, you don't know how to put the pieces together. And so the metaphor is that, the current literature says all these different things, and they don't really go together, and sometimes they contradict each other. You want to figure out how to fit all those pieces together into a puzzle that actually gives you a nice picture. That's the story I give my students, right? That's easy, just find a puzzle. Well,
I hated it when advisors told
yeah.
me that.
Yeah, it's damn tough. Like, if I knew how to do that, I'd be doing that. And so the more practical advice is just study stuff you like. Like, if you're interested in something, that will motivate you to keep working on it, and you'll enjoy it, and it won't feel like work at all.
And I think the thing I would add here, at least that I've found, is that starting with a bigger question is usually better, because everyone around can help you narrow it down into a manageable research topic, but at least then you have a framing, a literature you're speaking to, a big puzzle that you want to study, and you can fit it in that. But if you start with a very narrow question, it's often it's not as common to get feedback on, well, how can we extract from that and learn something more? And it's often harder to do that in general. So that would just be my advice, is think about what interests you in a big way about the world, and then from there figure out how you can feasibly study that.
Yeah. Other questions?
You mentioned, like, I don't know, it's possible to choose, like, two or three major mistakes one should make when submitting a paper.
The question is 2 to 3 main mistakes that people use when submitting a paper. Or in grad school. Wow. How much time do we have? Well, not paying attention to what the reviewer said. That's a big one.
So this, I'm not sure it's about submitting, but one of the things that was hammered into me for years and I realized was valuable was that people really hate it when you oversell what you can say. And when you say, like in your paper, I am going to show to you that I have, solved this issue, or you say that my method, which is what we're all here, proves that I have identified this effect, when maybe that's not quite true. And what I found is that people are extremely much more receptive to saying, here's what I can tell you, here's all of the things that I've done to be able to tell you that, and here's why I think it speaks to something important and big. And usually they see it, but they get angry when you try to say something bigger than what you've actually done.
Another problem I see is I can always tell when a grad student submits a paper when I get it as a review, because the lit review, the literature review, or the foundation will be like 6 pages. Like, look, we know that you read all this stuff, but it needs to be a tight 2 pages, right? Present what we know about this issue in broad terms, characterize different schools of thought, and then move directly onto your theory and your explanation for the gap in the literature or whatever. Don't have these long lit reviews. No one likes those at all.
You can even integrate the lit review into your theory and talk about how you draw from certain things as you develop your hypotheses.
As long as you make it clear what's your theory and what's your contribution. Because otherwise people will be like, I can't dig through this and find exactly what your argument is and how you're progressing, how we know about this issue, or what we know. That was 3 things.
There
Ed.
was a question.
So, with regard to the points you were making about side projects, how do you deal with what can be competing pressures about building a clear research profile in general on the one hand versus some publications better than no publications? You just know the second.
So the question is, how do you balance the incentive to produce a clear research agenda versus the incentive to do all these side projects with the hopes of getting some publications, because some publications are better than no publications. I mean, Ed's on my committee, so we've chatted about this a lot. He doesn't want to know what I have to say.
So I think what I can say now, also after being out of grad school, is it gets only harder the further along you get, because more and more side projects present themselves, more and more opportunities. And so it's all about making a strategic choice that's valuable to you. And it may be you have like 10 opportunities in a variety of different things, and you have to say, I'm going to focus on this like paper that is publishable but somewhat related to my work, or helps me learn something that I want to know already, and so I'm willing to give it that time. But to me, it's a time trade-off, and the dissertation takes a lot of time. I think we'll talk about this maybe at some point, but I think the job market paper is a really critical part of all of this, and it takes a lot of time to develop. And so it has to be something that is worth that trade-off. But I think that the earlier you are in grad school, the easier it is to divert some time into something that is will generate like a publication, for example. But where maybe I will say is that because side projects can easily take over your life, so create boundaries for it. And this is something I was going to talk about, balancing teaching and research, but setting it will work differently for everyone. But for me, what I did was I actually, at the start of every week, opened my calendar and allocated time slots to different things. So Wednesday, 8 a.m. to like whenever I stopped working, that was dissertation time, and it was untouched time. I would allocate some time to teaching and then some time to side projects, and you have to hold very firm to that unless that side project is presenting you an opportunity. I think another thing I would just quickly mention, which is that I found that there are some side projects that you can sort of waylay into your other main work, and that's really the best way to do it. And I do think it ties into some of the other things we've said, which is not necessarily hesitating to ask for things. So I've worked on a co-authored project where I was running a survey in India with this other person on this other topic, and I went in and I said, I'm putting a lot of time into this. Can I have a module in this survey that's just mine, and I get that data and no one else, and I can use that in my dissertation? Absolutely, hands down, no issue. And then all of a sudden, that investment became really valuable for me. It varies based on what you're doing, but I think if you can find projects you can sort of co-opt or sort of coerce into being useful, that's the best. And then the final thing I'll say, which is something that is more a statement because I need to take my own advice, that it's really hard to say no. It's incredibly hard, and you have to have that long-run goal in mind, because the challenge with the dissertation, as will turn into if you're writing a book or doing your own work, whatever it may be afterwards, is that it's the easiest thing to put on the back burner because everything else has someone emailing you saying, why haven't you gotten me this? Or a deadline to return assignments, or whatever it may be, a conference where you have to get that paper out in time. And so this is not necessarily advice on how to do that better, but more just that it's a skill that somehow we all have to learn, and one I am definitely still working on.
Any other questions about publishing? Thiago? So the question is, could we talk a little bit about book chapters, advantages and disadvantages? I have never published in a book chapter. So, have you?
I have.
So what I imagine some of the advantages are, you get to work on something and the review process isn't as stringent, it isn't as difficult.
Yeah.
And so if you've got a project that you think is still useful and deserves to be in a book, but maybe would have a difficult time with the traditional review process, maybe you can do it there. I know from serving on search committees, book chapters are not weighted very highly, especially compared to articles. I mean, I barely even look at a book chapter compared to an article. But
Yeah, no, I would say, so I have published in a book chapter, but it was a paper I was working on, and my advisor, who I was working with, even said, he was like, don't give us the good stuff. Give us, put something together for this that you can do pretty easily, but, save what you think can be a paper for a journal. And so my only advice is that if it's a useful thing to do and to get a publication, absolutely, go do it, if that's the calculation for you. If, however, you're resource constrained, as we all are, you don't have a ton of time, but you want a publication, I would invest way more time into something you think could be a really good journal article, and just say no to other opportunities that come, but have that single-minded focus on your other work, if that's something you have in mind.
But if the book edited volume is part of a conference, then certainly go to that smaller conference, network with those people, get those connections, and then if the book chapter comes out of it, then that's another good thing. So. So the question is, how do you update a literature review and make it exhaustive when new things are coming out all the time, right? One thing that I find that's difficult is reading new stuff. And so when you're in grad school, you read all the stuff for your class. When you're preparing for comps, you read all the stuff for your different areas. When you're writing your dissertation, you read all that. At my stage of my career, I very rarely read new stuff, and that's tough. And so you have to put aside time to read, the new AJPS or APSR that comes out. So I have a tough time doing that, to actually keeping my lit review and my knowledge of the literature where it should be.
I think I agree completely, but I was thinking There are a couple things that I found useful. So the first is that I follow the rabbit hole. So if I find one paper, I'll go onto Google Scholar and see who's cited that paper and who's gotten citations for that. And then I'll open those papers and I'll go to their lit reviews and see who they cite. And then you follow that down. And in some ways, I will do that at the stage when I'm writing the lit review, but I'll also do it right before I send something out to just make sure I've covered as much as possible. And even if it's just to see, like, is this something I need to cite or is this something I need to, like, really fully read? The other thing I'll say is that the absolute best way I've seen this is to talk about my work with other people and to present it at conferences. The number one most common thing someone in the hallway will say when you tell them, like, just a topic you're working on is, oh, you should read this, or have you heard of this? And so the more people you can just mention your paper to, and even ask them explicitly, is there something you think I should be referencing in this? Is there a literature I'm not thinking about that I should be speaking to? I think that's another way to leverage presentations and conferences and even just interpersonal interactions to very clearly, discreetly, and in a short amount of time supplement a lit review.
Other questions? Yes.
Do you have any tips on selecting the journal you submit?
Do you have any tips about selecting the journal to submit to? Well, you've got to be realistic about your goals, right? So not everything you write is going to end up in the American Political Science Review. Some of the stuff, it's a good paper, but it just needs to find a home in a lesser journal, a smaller journal. And so you need to be realistic about the prospects of success for that. And also you need to keep in mind what your time horizon is. So if you are in January and you need to start submitting application packets for the fall, then you're not going to send it to the American Political Science Review because it's going to get rejected, and that'll waste 4 months. And then you've got to revise it and then send it back somewhere else. You need to think about, when do you need this publication? Do you need it in 3 or 4 years? Because then you can start at a really good journal and then work your way down if it gets rejected. Or do you need this to be on your CV in 3 months? If you only have 3 months, then you better be clear that you're better be sure that you're sending it to the right level of journal. And substantively, the papers that you're citing in your work are probably from 3 or 4 journals. And those are the journals that are probably going to be interested in your project. And so I would look at the types of papers you're citing and then try to send it to one of those journals.
Yeah, that's almost everything I'd say. The only thing I'd add is, as a grad student, like, we have almost no information about how this works, and our committees and the other professors have a lot more information about, you know, where would this paper fit? I don't want to overshoot, I don't want to undershoot, where should I put it? And so this is another thing that I think it's actually okay to explicitly ask a faculty member about, to say, I have this paper, where should I send it? And have them give you advice.
Yeah. And don't be afraid about overshooting, right? Because everything gets rejected the first time, or almost everything gets rejected. And if you think about it, every piece that was in the APSR, AJPS, or JOP, they sent it there, right? And so they thought it was good enough, and maybe it got rejected at a better place and then fell down. And so always shoot high, as long as your advisor or whoever you have read it agrees with that.
And even for another reason, which is that even if you think that there's like a 0% probability to be accepted, you'll get a really great set of comments. And so you can see it just as a, like, I don't have an expectation right now. I have enough time. My time frame is long enough. I don't feel I've gotten enough feedback on the paper to get it where I really want it. So what I'm going to do is send it somewhere that I don't think it can get feedback, and then send it where I really want it to go.
Yeah. Other questions about publishing?
Was there one over here that we kept missing? Yeah.
How many versions do you guys write until final paper?
That's a great question. So how many versions do we get through before it actually gets published? I want to do this at some point, because starting from the first draft all the way to it actually coming out, I'd say 20 drafts. And the first few drafts that you write might not even look like the one that gets accepted and comes out. Like it's it can be such a frustrating yet rewarding experience because, you write all these beautiful words and these paragraphs and this argument, and then the reviewer just trashes it. So you're like, well, I got to go try it again, and you try something different, and you know what? That one works. And so you figured that out, and you put together the puzzle. It's such a great feeling. And so
And horrible.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's
But I think that was something that, I was really attached to my writing, and I was like, I've invested so much in this paper. I've spent, how many hours writing it. And one of the biggest lessons I learned in grad school was that you have to be comfortable taking a red pen and slashing your work apart. And just saying, I'm okay throwing away the hundreds of hours I've already put into it to get to the next iteration and the next iteration, to the point where I'm not sure any of my papers, if you were to compare the first and the last version, even share a sentence. Unfortunately, that's not quite accurate, but even though they might have the exact same evidence.
Yeah, you've got to get used to cutting your words. And shorter articles, I think, are better. So if you can don't send an article out to a journal with 45 pages. Just don't do that. It's not getting read, right? Reviewer's going to skip a few pages here and there. Try to shoot for 35 to 37, around there. It's also easier for the editor to look at a short article and think, yeah, I can support that being an R&R than a long article. The reason why is that editors don't get told by the publishing company how many articles they can accept. They get told how many pages. And so smaller articles are easier for the editor to fit in and to accept than longer articles.
And I do think this does highlight one other thing, which is just that that in grad school and in classes, we're taught how to write the methods and do the methods section. We're taught how to write the lit review a bit. And yet it seems one of the most critical things about landing something in a publication is how you frame the paper. And that's the part that really changes the most, is this framing, which you've talked about a bit.
So what do? Well, you look at the papers that are really good, that you cite and that you think are, transform the field and all that sort of stuff, and do what they do. Follow the same sort of structure. Don't plagiarize. But follow the structure. See how they set up their research questions, see how they review the literature, and do the same sorts of things. Right? If it worked for them, it'll probably work for you.
Yeah.
So about publishing, you said that it's generally a good idea to present it in a conference before trying to publish it. So what would you say are the main differences between a paper you prepare for a conference and a paper you're going to publish?
So the question is, what are the main differences between a paper you would take for a conference and a paper you would publish? The paper you take to a conference is half done. It's bad. It's just a set of results. No, don't. When you submit to a conference, write the paper. But chances are that paper is not going to be very good.
I think a conference paper is just an early draft of the paper you'd send to publication. It's version 1 or 2 that you're getting out there, and people are okay with that. They expect that. And by the time you're submitting it for publication, it's version 10.
Yep.
And then by the time it's actually getting published, it's version 50 or whatever it may be at that point.
What about publishing in non-peer-reviewed journals? What do you think about?
So the question is, what about publishing in non-peer-reviewed journals? If you're trying to get an academic job, it matters none. It doesn't help you at all. Now, it might help your how widespread you are in the discipline if you're writing blog articles that highlight research that you've done, right? That might get more people reading that original article, and that's not peer-reviewed. But submitting to a journal that is not peer-reviewed, it's probably not going to help you at all for a research academic type job.
Yeah. And the truth is, these things all come down to trade-offs. And so is it worth investing your time in that way, or can you be investing it in something else? And so I think that's how all of these sort of costs and benefits should be weighed, because there's a lot that we have to do as grad students. So.
Yeah,
What about those journals owned by, the governments or local agencies that are trustable institutions, but they are not academic institutions?
So I don't have much knowledge or experience in that, but what I can say is that this is a great question for your committee, because what matters at the end of the day, if you want to be on an academic route, is how will a job committee view this publication on my CV? And if they will look at that and say, this is an asset, like this is something I want from this candidate that sets them apart, then go for it. But if it's not, and the problem is that's hard information to have. There's huge, we were eventually going to talk about the job market. But the hardest part are these deep information asymmetries where we've never been really on the market, we've never been on the other side of that curtain, but somehow we have to pitch to it. And so this is where relying on committee members, having a mix of talking to some junior people who've gone through the process recently with some senior people who've seen so many different job applications can be useful.
You want to skip ahead to job market?
Sure.
So with the job market stuff, Sole obviously has been through it recently, and I'm kind of on the other side now. So I've been through it a couple years ago, whatever. But I've been through it on the other side. So I've been on a number of hiring committees, and I can kind of tell what works and what doesn't. So if you want to talk about your experience.
So I'm happy, this is an area where I could talk about 1,000 different things. And so I'm happy to answer questions on any aspect. I think the one big takeaway I had from being on the job market was that people want to see who you're going to be as a researcher, and they want to see what they think you will contribute to this field that we're in. And so what that meant practically was that your job market paper matters a huge amount, what you present, what you put in front of them, in terms of they're going to use it to define how are you going to approach methods, how are you going to actually answer questions, but also what kinds of questions do you ask, how big are they, and then how do you link these two together. There seemed to be, you get a little bit of leeway if you pose a big question but answer it in only a certain way, so long as you're honest and clear in what you're doing and why you've approached it. And then I think the other part is that when you frame your package, it all needs to be cohesive in this way. You need to show, my sense, this is, but show them who you are, and here's how every piece of everything I have done has made me who I am, and here's who I'm going to become, and here's why you want me, because I'm going to become this person. I'm going to approach this research agenda. It's going to include, here are the topics that make me that excite me, that are interesting to me. Here's how I'm going to study them. Here's what I'm going to do. And so I think often as grad students, or I don't know, in my conversations with other grad students, what we thought were the things that mattered in the job market were 100% absolutely not what seemed to matter. It didn't matter, from what I could observe, it didn't seem to matter that my CV wasn't 1,000 pages long, but more that there was a story behind it and a vision for what might come in 5 to 7 years' time. And so I think leaning into that is what I took away.
Yeah, so when you submit your application, what you don't usually realize is that there's 200 other people who submitted to that same position. And so the hiring committee has 3 or 4 people on it, maybe a grad student, and the hiring committee has 8 other committees that they're on. And they've got their own research projects, and they're advising their own students, and they've got their own families at home. They've got a lot of other stuff going on. So the hiring committee has to figure out a way to go from this stack of 200 applicants to a stack of 25, and then a stack of 3 or 4 to actually interview. And so you've got to think about how to get from that big stack where they're barely even looking through it to the stack of 25 or 30 where they're actually sitting down, reading your letters of recommendation, looking at your cover letters and your writing samples, things like that. And so don't give them any reason to go, well, that's an easy application to throw away and not really think about. And so part of what Sole said that's really important is being cohesive, making sure that you fit completely for that job description. And so look at what the job description is and make sure that you're tailoring your cover letter to that specific job, right? Don't copy and paste the name of the school in all the places except for one. That happens. And so you're like, well, that's kind of sloppy, and it's an obvious reason. Maybe it's a sign that they're sloppy in their own work, and so it's a good reason to take that off the list. So if you're applying for an IR job, don't put a bunch of working papers on there that are not IR, right? Because then that sends a signal that maybe you're too scatterbrained, or maybe you get distracted by these side projects, and maybe that'll cast doubt on whether you can get tenure or things like that. So try to reduce the number of reasons for them to throw your application away. Yes. Questions?
Do you have any specific advice for foreigner students who want to apply for postdoc in the US?
So the question is, do we have any advice for foreigners applying to postdocs in our country? I don't know of any advice that's specific to foreigners. I mean, it's when we're looking at applications, we're not necessarily dividing them based on foreigners or American citizens. So it's the same advice that we give overall. Make sure you fit. Make sure you demonstrate how you fit. Make sure you try to present a story of where you're going and where you've been and how you're going to help that professor, right? Postdocs are all about whoever's in charge of that center or whoever's postdoc that is, make sure that that person thinks that you would be a valuable part of their team.
Yeah, I think I can't say anything necessarily about applying to be a postdoc in the U.S., but I can say something as someone who came from a grad school in the U.S. and is now doing a postdoc at a foreign institution. The challenge is that there are already a ton of information asymmetries where you don't know much about anything, and that's just only heightened when it's not your country and the system that you're used to. And so I would just say it's more reason to get information, because a lot of these, as Laron said, a lot of these positions are attached to centers that have particular missions that maybe you don't know what it's about. So either try to figure that out and tailor your application to that, or ask a bunch of people to say, this is what I really want to go study in this area. Can you help me find the right positions that fit my package and who I am?
Other questions?
And they don't have to be about, at this point, I think we can open it up to questions
Yeah.
about anything in grad school.
Yeah.
So.
For the next 2 minutes,
Yeah.
we'll open it up to questions.
we got 3 minutes.
Anybody besides Thiago? Okay, Thiago.
We have.
Oh, there's
nope.
over there. Oh.
Over there. Jonica.
Do you have any advice for people who are not from the US and the area with the number of networks available to us on how we could like for people from foreign institutions really navigate these kinds of like hotspots?
So the question is, do we have any advice on foreign students on how to get involved in networks in the U.S.?
So the first thing that comes to my mind is what we talked about in networking. So pull on the networks you have to help you access other networks. So I don't know if people here go to LASA, but a lot of people from around the world are there. Show up, email them, say, can I have a coffee with you? And chat with them about your work and start to build on those networks. Or have your professor who maybe has a co-author in another country or who went to school there introduce you to someone that might be of interest. I think the truth is and I think this is true in general as well, but just don't hesitate to try to make those opportunities. I think the biggest challenge as a grad student is that for most people, almost nothing is ever handed to you. And it means that, and everyone's super busy, so figuring out what you need, unfortunately, no one else is going to do that. And it's not always that you'll have an advisor who will say, oh, I think you need to be doing this, why don't we make it happen? But my sense is that everyone is extremely helpful and wants to help when you go in and say, here's what I need, here's what I want, can you help me achieve these goals? And so just making sure to ask for it.
Thiago?
We're gonna allow him. We're gonna allow him.
Among the recommendation letters, but we must have one for your chair, right?
Yeah.
So is it also true for a co-chair? Do you believe that?
So the question is, we said earlier that one of your letters or recommendation has to be from your advisor or the chair of your committee. Is that necessarily the case with your co-chair? I would think that a letter would have to come from both co-chairs on your committee. Otherwise it looks a little strange. Like maybe the student doesn't have a good relationship with their co-chair, or maybe it's a problem student, and if it's a problem student, they turn into problem professors and they become pains in the ass, and then like no one wants to work with them, and so I would think you would need them from both, yeah.
Someone else?
Yeah.
What about co-authorship? Do you like to suggest co-authorship with other grad students, or do you think a solo project co-authorship would be slightly better?
Yeah, so the question is, what about co-authoring and publishing or solo? And so my philosophy is work with people who are smarter than you, and then it'll make you look really good. And I've done that throughout my career. You guys will meet Guy Witten next week. I've worked with Andy. I've worked with Thiago. Work with people who are smarter than you. It'll make you look good. But I think there's this, I envision sort of a ranking system in terms of publications. Solo-authored pieces are up here. Pieces that you co-author with a peer, like another grad student, are up there. Pieces with a professor who is not tenured are right there. Pieces with your tenured chair professor are probably lower, right? And so, huh? Why?
Because the credit is given.
Yeah, because you can't, so a committee might not be able to tell how much of that is Thiago, how much of it is me, right? And I've published before, and so I know how to do it, so maybe Thiago didn't do much. But if Thiago is publishing with Flavio, then that's good. They're both grad students, and so it's obvious that they both had.
And there's even
Big parts of
research
it.
on this that shows that credit attribution is usually given to the most senior person on the paper. That said, you can, so I agree exactly with that, and I would add two small points. One is that some people, and I have had the privilege of having this, have incredible advisors who are willing to essentially make very clear the work and the contribution you make on a project, and then I think that can help balance out some of that. When credit is clearly, allocated or explained, then it's not as big an issue. And then I think the second point I would say is that I think if your goal is a publication and having that land you a job, I agree with how the ranking that Laron has said. I do think, however, that there can be value in working with someone senior just to learn how things are done. So again, it's all about these trade-offs and where you're at in the process and what you want, what skills you want to develop and what you want to get out of it. But you should know what it is that, is likely going to be the outcome and sort of how you're going to benefit from it.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say that you should not work with your advisor. If you look at my CV, like, I've worked with my advisor, who's Guy Witten. I've worked with him a few times, and he's the reason I'm sitting here right now and as a professor. So those sorts of co-authorships are amazingly helpful, and they teach you how to publish. They teach you the stuff that you don't learn in class. So please do
But
that. Just realize that
they're
not
different animals. They yield different benefits, and so depending on where you're at and what you need, you have to weigh those.
Any more questions? No? So, Soledad, Laron, thank you very much for your very useful talk. It was a very useful for all of us.
Thank you
very much.
Yeah, I hate being in